Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join SQFI for today's webinar. My name is Sarah Milenich. I'm the Director of Marketing and Sales at SQFI, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Today's webinar, Revisiting Your Supplier Approval Program, is presented by Gary Smith, who's the Director of Food Safety Systems at Eurofins. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you of our webinar protocol. First, I'd like to remind you that this webinar will be recorded. It will take us a few business days to process this recording, but you should find it on both our YouTube channel and our events page of our website by next Tuesday, which is October 31st. Second, if you have any questions for the speakers during the presentation, please feel free to write them in the chat box that is located on the right-hand side. We will be copying these over to the presenter as they come in, and he will answer them at the end of the presentation during our Q&A period. Also, before I introduce Gary, I would like to give you some updates with SQFI. The rules and implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act are on everyone's minds. Sorting through the FDA FSMA rules can be a very time-consuming and confusing task. So we've put together our FSMA resource page to help you understand the legal and regulatory complexities of FSMA while alleviating some of the pain points our stakeholders are struggling with regarding implementation and execution. In addition to the comparisons the Atchison Group did for SQFI of the preventive controls for human food and the produce safety rules to the elements of the SQF Level 2 certification, we encourage you to visit this page to use the preventive controls and produce safety audit checklist and guidance documents we've created for our stakeholders to use as a guide for identifying the necessary steps to bridge any gaps between a company's SQF program and the PC and produce safety rules. It is important to note, however, that these documents do not guarantee compliance, nor does it absolve the supplier from ensuring that they meet all the aspects of FSMA. While the checklist is voluntary and will not be scored, it is a valuable tool to help suppliers identify and understand any differences between the SQF program and the FSMA rules. We also have a great new resource. This was just posted to our website about a week ago, and it's a handy guide that easily references the changes from our Edition 7.2 to Edition 8. The resource can be found on the Documents tab of the SQFI website after all the codes are where you download. Here's a screenshot of where you can locate it. We have one more information day left of this year, and it is going to be the day before the Food Safety Consortium in November. The SQF Information Day is a day-long face-to-face informational seminar designed to introduce food suppliers at all levels of the food chain to the benefits of food safety and quality certification. Information Day attendees will leave with new insights, connections, and a clear understanding of how you can implement a food safety and quality program that best fits the needs of your business and the needs of your customers. We are currently seeking sponsors for this Information Day in Schaumburg. So if you're interested in sponsoring this Information Day, give me a call. At the beginning of 2017, SQFI changed the way we communicated with our stakeholders. We've decided to send out a monthly newsletter that encompasses all of our monthly activities. Make sure you're on this mailing list so you don't miss the latest updates, trends, and changes to the SQF program. See what we're learning about. Be reminded of all of our trainings and what we're reading. And we normally have a supplier spotlight or something interesting that spotlights one of our suppliers or stakeholders. We have 3 remaining training classes coming up for in 2017, and our 2018 professional updates dates are now listed on the website on the events page. You can go there and make sure that you reserve your spot and put the date on your calendar. And the SQF conference is coming up in about 2 weeks. We're very, very excited about it. We're also very busy planning for it. We have a record number of attendees already registered for the meeting, with over 850, and registration is still growing. So make sure you check out the SQF conference webpage and the pre-conference training classes that happened 2 days before. We still have a few openings in the popular classes, but make sure you have it on your calendar. It's a great event that you won't want to miss. And here's our contact information for customer service, our database, assistance, marketing sponsorships. And also, we are, where else we're going to be out and about for the rest of 2017. So make sure to stop by if you're at PLMA or the Food Safety Consortium, just say hello. And with further ado, our speaker today is Gary Smith. Gary has a MS in Environmental Biology from Governor State University and a BS in Animal Sciences from the University of Illinois. Gary brings over 20 years of industry experience to his duties at Eurofins Safety Systems. He helps food producers, distributors, and packagers of all sizes to navigate the complexities of achieving compliance with the latest food safety standards, creating value beyond certification. In addition, he oversees all aspects of the supply chain business, including vendor, GMP, GLP, and warehouse distribution auditing services and certifications. Gary has worked as a regulator, buyer, supplier, trainer, auditor, head of a CB certification body, and head of a standard owner. With the industry experience in produce, meat, bakeries, dairy, warehousing, distribution, packaging, beverage, and confectionery, this broad perspective means Gary is uniquely equipped to help organizations determine which standards offer the best benefits to their business and their most practical strategies for complying with them. Gary is has a handful of awards and certifications. He's a certified quality auditor for HACCP under the American Society of Quality. He's a certified HACCP instructor with the International HACCP Alliance and National Seafood Alliance. He's members of IASP and the National Environmental Health Association. He's a registered sanitation and food safety auditor, credentialing subject matter expert with the National Environmental Health Association and the state of Missouri. So with all of that, I'm going to pass the bar over to Gary. And enjoy his presentation. Gary?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Appreciate everyone's time today, and certainly appreciate our partnership with SQF. We are very humbled and happy to be able to partner with them in many activities. Some of those activities that Sarah mentioned, the SQF Info Day, we've partnered with them on those, and certainly we're excited about the upcoming SQF conference, where we are going to have a very prominent role, and very excited to continue to work with SQF and continue to grow the program. And certainly excited by our participation in the Learning Lunch webinar today. Real quickly, just real quick about Eurofins. We are a very large global laboratory services provider of both microbiology and chemistry services. But in addition to that, we have many other activities around public health that we provide on a global basis to our customers. Our goal is to ensure that we have good customer satisfaction and providing solutions to drive and improve our global health. We do have a global presence, over 350 laboratories in over 50 countries. And again, we pride ourselves for the food industry in being a full service provider for our food safety services, of which I head, our microbiology testing, of which we have a full gamut of regional laboratories to assist. And we have some of the expertise, some of the most advanced expertise on the planet at our disposal in a variety of different locations. We are a full service provider of training, SQF Licensed Training Center, and very excited about that, as well as all of the FSMA preventive controls for animal food, human food, Foreign Supplier Verification Program, and produce food safety. We do have a consulting group that goes in and assists folks in getting ready for SQF or getting ready for FSMA or getting ready for the new exchange to version 8 of SQF. We've been very busy doing many of those types of services for our customers, and we have a full auditing portfolio that we have available for folks, again, to assist with those supplier verification activities that we're going to be talking about here over the next 45 minutes or so. We are a fully accredited certification body, of course, SQF, as well as many of the other GFSI schemes that we can participate in and conduct certification audits for globally. And, you know, one of the key for us is that although we have the global expertise and the competency and the full service provider, at the end of the day, it really comes down to personalized customer service, and that's where we feel like even though we have the global presence, we want everyone to feel like we have a very local, unique touch with every individual customer contact that we have, and that's what we pride ourselves on. So today, what we're going to talk about is the supplier approval and verification activity. So we're going to go through a few case studies. We're going to talk about SQF in version 8, what the requirements are for supplier approval and verification. We're going to talk about with FSMA and the Food Safety Modernization Act, what are some of the regulatory requirements that are being implemented around us now, and we just went through another implementation date last September. What is it, and how does FSMA work with SQF, and how do they work together, and what are your expectations when you're going to be audited? We'll cover that. I also want to get into a little bit on, you know, certificate of analysis, product specifications, you know, those other verification activities of testing. There's a lot of, I think, some misnomer or some misinformation about, you know, certificate of analysis. So we want to tell a little bit about what they are and what they're not, and then just really get into the best practices of what an approved supplier program should be. What should my verification activities be? And again, for SQF and FSMA, what do I have to do for compliance? So I want to talk about two very famous, I guess, incidents, and it certainly underlies, and I'll repeat it again, it underlies the issue that we know and what we've identified, and SQF has got data, and the CDC and the FDA all have data that shows that a majority, you know, at least 25% of the incidents, the recalls, the outbreaks that occur in the food industry are due to bringing in contaminated ingredients from a supplier. And two very famous cases of that I'm going to show you here. The first one from the mid-90s was Schwann's ice cream. Ice cream contaminated with salmonella. The salmonella came in from tankers, which were previously hauling liquid pasteurized eggs, liquid raw eggs, I'm sorry, they weren't pasteurized, and cross-contamination from the fact that those tankers had not been properly washed in hauling the milk from previously hauling liquid eggs. And a couple of things that came out of this. One, we realized that a salmonella can cause outbreaks in ice cream, which really hadn't happened much before at all. Two, we realized that salmonella can have a very low infectious dose, and you see there, you know, almost 250,000 people got sick with an infectious dose as low as 1 viable cell in 100 grams of ice cream, which are obviously both very prominent, but probably the most prominent activity for the food industry was the whole tanker wash ticket system. Prior to this, we did not have tanker wash tickets as an issue or concern, and now obviously the standard practice that if you're hauling any type of liquid or any type of dry bulk type product or ingredient, a tanker wash ticket is required at receipt, and that basically stems from this outbreak and this recall. So that was a very prominent activity, showing again where supply chain, and not even really from the supplier standpoint, but really from the transporter, causing concern. And certainly the next one that I'm sure everyone who's been around the food industry for a while is very familiar with is the Peanut Corporation of America outbreak from 2008, 2009. PCA sold peanut butter contaminated with salmonella. There's many stories about how, you know, PCA did testing and retesting for salmonella and you know, continued to test it or retest it until they got a negative, and then they would ship it. There was, investigation showed many pest infestation issues, sanitation issues, and again, couple of prominent things about this. One, knowing who your suppliers are. This recall just went on and on and on and on, as many folks did not realize that they had product coming through from PCA, from other sources, other agents, brokers, et cetera. And the other thing was, this was the first case in the United States where there was actually criminal prosecution as a result of a food safety issue. And, some of the prominent personnel within that organization actually went to jail because of this issue. And, that was the first time. It's not been the last. And there will be continued to be criminal activities around food safety issues going forward, but this was the first time that had occurred. And again, it was, one supplier who had concerns and had issues and basically spread those issues into their customers, and those customers did not really have the verification activities in place to, ensure or minimize their risk. So we know that, bringing product in as clean as possible is an important activity that we must do. So how do we do that? Well, methods of supplier approval and verification, and I'll use the term supplier approval and supplier verification. They're somewhat synonymous. They're somewhat different. Obviously, the supplier approval is the beginning step. It's how do you get a supplier into your network? What is the criteria? What's the vetting process? What is the review? And then the verification is the ongoing monitoring, the ongoing activity to say, okay, well, once you're approved, what do we do after that? And unfortunately, too often, previously we focused on the approval and we stopped it there. So once they were approved, basically they were in, and we didn't really do anything to monitor or verify their activities going forward. Kind of our old school way of doing supplier approval and verification was questionnaires. Maybe we had a purchasing specification. You get a letter of guarantee from the customer once a year, or from the supplier once a year, that says that they're going to do well. Or maybe you just have a handshake and not even have a written contract or a specification that says what are we sending back and forth. As we move forward, and certainly programs like SQF have helped raise the bar, as it were, on what are the best practices for supplier monitoring, approval, and verification. FSMA has helped push that along as well. Now we go into on-site audits, we go into testing programs, supplier verification, and sampling. And we're going to talk about each of those in a little bit more activity. So let's, as a preview, as it were, some of the things that we're really going to focus on and some of the activities that are considered best practice for supplier verification today include specification review. Make sure it's in your contract that you're going to be doing product testing, that you're going to require an on-site audit. Compliance label review. Are they making claims? The whole GMO fee, food fraud is a concern certainly around that as well. Again, a testing program. Is it going to be a split sample program? Is it going to be a certificate of analysis program? How are you going to use testing as a verification tool? Certainly FSMA adds in the whole international versus domestic suppliers, and we'll talk quite a bit about that. Physical product quality checks, and then audits. So we're going to go through, again, each of those in a lot of detail. But what I wanted to do right now is focus just a second on SQF's requirement for supplier approval. So if we look to version 8, which we know is going to be implemented starting January 2nd of 2018, so all folks who have certifications, audit activity with SQF after January 2nd of 2018 are going to be against version 8. And if we look at version 8, specifically the supplier approval criteria, which is a mandatory element under Module 2, 2.4.4, what we see is a very similar content to what we had previously in 7.2. We see that we have to have a documented procedure for selecting, evaluating, approving, and monitoring of suppliers. That has to be based on prior performance of the supplier and risk of the raw materials, as well as a risk level of the supplier. Include product specifications, certificates of conformance where applicable. Include a summary of food safety controls implemented by the supplier. Now, one important note to make there is that, that summary of food safety controls right now within the SQF world could be a thing like a questionnaire, survey where the supplier fills it out themselves and sends it into their customer. And basically, depending on how you build your program based on risk, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, for low-level type products under the SQF program, that would be sufficient to monitor or get a summary of their food safety controls versus having to go out and do an audit per se. So again, here's the difference between the approval process, which is really those first 4 bullets, and then the bottom 2 is the more of the verification. What are SQF requires that we have methods and frequencies documented for how do we monitor approved suppliers on an ongoing basis. And that's all suppliers, high risk, low risk, medium risk. What does that look like? It doesn't require on-site audits, but it does require something. What are you going to do? Are you going to get a third-party audit? Are you going to send them another questionnaire? Are you going to go out and do a visit? Are you going to do testing? What is it that you're going to do to monitor those suppliers on an ongoing basis? And then lastly, a register of approved suppliers shall be kept. So again, so that, as your receivers and your folks on the dock, when product's coming in, how do they know product is coming from an approved supplier? And as we know, SQF requires the approval process to be location specific. It is not company specific. So you can't approve, one master company. You actually have to approve each specific location, and the locations must be, the approvals must be location specific. So that's version 8, element 2.4.4. And again, if you're familiar with 7.2, you'll recognize most of those elements are basically exactly the same. So really SQF, in going to version 8, has not changed their supplier approval really much at all. The requirements are pretty much the same. And to be fair, those are pretty much best practices. But one area where we do have a lot of questions from clients is around the whole risk. And anytime you bring up risk assessment or risk assignment to folks, they get quite nervous. It sounds scary. It's thought to be a very complex, a very intense, a very comprehensive process of risk assessment, risk management. How do we do high, medium, low? How do we use that? And I'm here to say that really it's up to you. And the SQF, the nice thing about the program is it has enough flexibility that it gives you the guidance of what do you need to do, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. Some people like that. Some people don't. Some people would prefer just tell me what to do. But here, when assigning risk, some of the things to think about include things like, what are my criteria? What am I going to use? Am I going to use the high, medium, low? Am I going to use a different criteria? I can use anything I want. And the point of the pictures here that I added is that, you can make it really complex, like the little graph at the bottom, or you can make it really simple. And I would say, especially for those folks just starting out, keep it simple. Don't make it, any more complicated than it has to be. There's nothing that says it has to be overly complicated. Try to keep it simple. But what you have to decide is, how do I determine if somebody's high risk, medium risk, or low risk? What are my criteria? What considerations do I have to take into account? So things like, what is the ingredient they're supplying me? Is it a ready-to-eat product that, potentially has a food safety risk? Is it going to be further processed? Are we going to further process it, or do we sell it to another customer who's going to further process it? Is it a key ingredient for us? Does it really define the functionality of our program or our product? If this ingredient doesn't perform the way it's supposed to, our finished product is never going to perform. Might not be a food safety issue, might be a quality issue. And even those folks at level 2 still have to have these types of considerations of approved suppliers to say, what are our risks and how do we assign those? So some of those types of things, certainly a ready-to-eat product, really should be higher risk. Low further processed products, salt, sugar, spices, all those spices, potentially depending on what kind of spice it may be, it might be a food safety issue. How is it processed? Is it irradiated? Is it not? So there's really a lot of, and that's what SQF asks, is that you go through the ingredients, you go through the suppliers, and you say, based on how it's made, what its history is, how do you use it, how do you determine if it's high, medium, or low risk, or whatever criteria you want to assign it. You don't have to use high, medium, or low. You can come up with your own. high, medium, low is the simplest. And again, I would recommend using high, medium, or low as much as you can, but keep it simple. Other things, other considerations, your relationship with your supplier. How long have you known them? Is it a new supplier? Do they change routinely? Or, have you been with them for 20 years and you've never had an issue? Have they had recalls? Have they had FDA warning letters? Have you had audit issues with them in the past? How quickly did they respond to corrective action? How much are they willing to partner with you? Are they open to having you come in to do a visit? Are they open to having a third-party audit? Or do they really, resist you from doing that? And then, once you get the risk levels assigned and you say, okay, here's my, these 10 suppliers are considered high risk based on these reasons. These, 15 suppliers are medium risk based on these reasons, and everybody else is low risk. Or maybe we just have high and low. We don't even have a medium. But then the key question then after that is, what are you going to do about it? What do you do with those high risk versus low risk? What does that mean to you? If somebody's considered high risk, what does that mean? Do you then require a certificate of analysis for them for every batch? Do you require, if they're low risk, maybe once a month we pull a split sample and we test, just test the product to verify that it meets specifications, or it's once a quarter, or it's once every 6 months. If they're high risk, we have to have them send us in a third-party audit. If they're low risk, they only have to send us in a questionnaire. So the key is using that risk assignments, you then use that into defining your verification activities. What do I have to do to monitor them going forward, and how do I use risk to determine those activities and the frequency and the schedule? And as an auditor coming in versus 7.2 or version 8, these are the questions they're going to be asking you. They're going to say, okay, how do you determine the risks? Which suppliers are which? And what does it mean to you? What do you do for high-risk suppliers? What do you do for low-risk suppliers? And what's the difference? So that's a key part that a lot of folks sometimes tend to struggle with. So let's flip gears for just a minute and talk a little bit about FSMA, because even though FSMA and SQF obviously are separate, they are related because SQF does have a clause under 2.4.1 that is a regulatory requirement. So basically what it states is that, all manufacturers must ensure that they meet local regulatory requirements. So where FSMA does go a little above and beyond SQF, and there's a few cases where it does, in the area of supplier approval and verification, which we're going to lay out for you here, where we do have, a FSMA going a little above and beyond SQF, the auditors will be verifying that as part of 2.4.1 regulatory requirement. So when your FSMA requirements kick in, and again, some of us just kicked in, the medium suppliers for food just kicked in September of this year. Animal food folks kicked in, large animal food suppliers kicked in September of this year for having the preventive control. When the FSMA requirements come online, then the auditors are going to be verifying those, even during an SQF audit, even though it may not be written directly into SQF, because there's that extra clause that says you have to meet local regulatory requirements. So the two areas that are unique for supplier approval and verification as part of FSMA include the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, and the first compliance date for everyone over 500 employees came May 30th of 2017. And as we probably know, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program basically says that international suppliers are subject to the preventive control rule for both human food and animal food, and they're required to have some level of verification that suppliers comply. And it's the importer of record who's responsible for ensuring that that paperwork is available. FDA is not going to be regulating this law at the border and stopping product from coming in. They're going to be assessing it compliance at the suppliers, at the domestic suppliers, importer of record. So the folks who take control of the product, who take physical control of the product, who take the product and actually change its nature. So those folks who receive it first, from the international suppliers and start to process it, those are the importers of record who are going to have the documentation showing that those foreign suppliers meet the preventive control rule. and that can be, any type of a third-party audit, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, conducted by a qualified auditor that basically shows that the supplier met the elements of the rule. The other part of FSMA that deals with supplier approval and verification is the supplier preventive control. This is for domestic suppliers and it's required when a supplier is conducting a control of a food safety hazard for the facility they are supplying. And when an audit is required to take place is when the supplier is controlling a significant food safety hazard. So again, here is we're going to talk a little bit about when you're doing your food safety plan as required under FSMA. Again, for those folks who FSMA applies to, obviously we know our friends who make our meat products, FSMA is not an issue. They deal with the USDA. But for everybody else, FSMA is our regulatory requirement. And for there, we have to do, when we're doing the food safety plan, we're doing the hazard analysis, and we have ingredients coming in. When we identify that that supplier is controlling the hazard on our behalf, we have to build a supplier preventive control to verify that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing and making sure that that control is addressed. So again, we know under the Food Safety Plan for FSMA that there, and these are slides from the Food Safety Preventive Control Alliance. I wanted to make sure that we give them credit for those. But we know when we're building the Food Safety Plan, supply chain preventive control is one of the preventive controls that will be employed and must be part of your food safety plan when the conditions are such that you need them. And again, similar to what SQF requires, FSMA is requiring when a supplier preventive control is required, you have to have an approved supplier program, you have to define those verification activities, conduct those verification activities, document those, and again, very similar to the SQF requirements around supplier approval and supplier verification. As you're doing your food safety plan, you're going through the idea. One thing where it's a little bit different than our past, where we're used to dealing with HACCP. At HACCP, we really focus on, product coming in at receiving and until we send it out, through shipping. And we always focus on what was under our control. And we didn't really worry much about before it got to us, and we really didn't worry much about after it left us. Well, under the food safety plan, under FSMA, we don't have that luxury. We have to consider the whole supply chain, and we have to think about our suppliers, and we have to think about us, and we have to think about our customers. And the key question that we have to answer is, when we're doing our hazard analysis and we identify that there is a hazard that requires a preventive control, we have to then define who along the supply chain is going to address it. Is it the supplier? If it is the supplier, then I have to build a supplier preventive control. If it's me, then I have to build a process preventive control, which is my HACCP plan today. And if it's my customer, then I basically have to get written communication from them that they understand their requirement and they are going to take control of the hazard and deal with it through a validated process preventive control. So what are those supplier verification activities as required under FSMA? And two things here that they're really focusing on: conduct one or more of the following verification activities before using and periodically thereafter. Okay, so this is before the supplier is being used: on-site audit or sampling and testing. So basically what FDA is saying is you have to do one or the other, whereas SQF basically says you kind of determine that when you're doing your risk assessment and you define what verification activities you want to do. Whereas with the FDA in the FSMA rule is basically saying in some cases you're going to have to do an on-site audit. Sampling and testing is more voluntary, but it is a verification activity they would expect to see in certain circumstances. We're going to talk about who can do those activities as well, but understand that the supplier verification activities are either an on-site audit or sampling and testing. So again, as you're comparing FSMA requirements to SQF, very similar, but FDA is actually going a little above and beyond and saying, we're defining when you have to do an audit versus just assessing the supplier's food safety controls. So let's talk about some of those supplier verification activities again. What this slide, again, from the Preventive Control Alliance is basically saying is that, you know, there are multiple folks within the supply chain who can do the supplier verification activities. It can be the supplier. They can provide a third-party audit testing. They can provide their own testing, but they can't do their own audit. So the supplier cannot be doing their own audit, obviously. So this means the whole idea of using a questionnaire to fulfill the requirement of an on-site audit is not going to be enough for FSMA when an on-site audit is required for supplier verification. That's not going to be enough. So you're going to have a third-party audit. That's what this rule is saying here. You know, brokers have a key role in supplier verification and supplier approval. The role that, you know, the brokers and agents play, while they're not under the rules specifically because they never really take physical possession of the product, but they take ownership in some cases. But really what they should be doing is they should be assisting their customers, who is the receiving facility, in gathering of this verification documentation, be it a third-party audit, be it the supplier testing activities. You know, they can be collecting this information and supplying it to the receiving facility, to their customer, so the receiving facility, the manufacturer, does not have to go out and get it themselves from their suppliers. And in some cases, the receiving facility may not know who the actual locations of those suppliers are, and they only know the broker, or they only know the agent. And I understand, you know, brokers and agents, sometimes they don't want to give up that information because then obviously, you know, they're not needed. But it's important to understand that, you know, in the age of FSMA, the anonymity of pulling from an unknown location as a supplier is not going to be acceptable. So we're going to have to be able to get by and have, you know, the agreements in place for protection so that a broker or an agent is able to provide, you know, documentation of compliance to the rule to their customer of locations that they have sourced from and specific locations that they have sourced from without the risk of, you know, losing that business or anything like that. So, you know, I know we've talked to quite a few agents and brokers who are a bit concerned that, you know, those locations they're pulling from are now going to be transparent to their customers. But, you know, really that's kind of how with the FSMA rule, that's really how it has to go. So what are the on-site audit requirements? When do I have to do an on-site audit under FSMA? Again, under SQF, I don't have to do one of my suppliers. I'm not required by SQF to do on-site audits of my suppliers. But under FSMA, I am in certain circumstances. When? An on-site audit is required when a supplier is dealing with a serious hazard on my behalf. So those serious hazards are those significant hazards that can cause injury or death in humans and animals. They call them SECOTA hazards. Things like Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli, obviously all the big ones. You know, some of the, you know, aflatoxins and you know, some of the chemical hazards as well fit into that. There isn't a list. FDA has not come out with a all-inclusive list of what these hazards are. They basically just say if it's a significant hazard, then you have to have an on-site audit. So the on-site audit, again, when the supplier is dealing with a hazard on your behalf, and that is a significant hazard, you must have an annual audit of that supplier. That annual audit, you know, must be done by a qualified auditor, which we'll see here. So who does the audit? The on-site audit has to be a qualified auditor, and that audit must be where they review the supplier's written HACCP or food safety plan and verify that the preventive controls are being met. There isn't a defined format for the on-site audit. It can be the SQF audit. I know SQF has come out with an addendum as well, which would certainly satisfy the requirement. It's a FSMA addendum specifically. That would satisfy the requirement. There's a lot of other audit tools that are FSMA specific that would satisfy the requirement. But the key there is it's, you know, a qualified auditor. What is a qualified auditor? Qualified auditor is basically someone who's been trained as an auditor or who has auditing experience. And, you know, as the facility who's under compliance to FSMA, you must have records of that auditor training or auditor log so that they, you know, you verify that they are a qualified auditor and who was doing the audits of your suppliers. Again, when a supplier preventive control is required. Now, some of the other verification activities that they talk about is sampling and testing. It's not required. FSMA does not require product testing, but they say that it is a verification activity that can and should be used, may be conducted, as it says there, may be conducted by the supplier, by an outside laboratory. Outside lab's got to be 17025 if you use an outside lab, or by the receiving facility, which would be, you. The results can be communicated in a certificate of analysis. We're going to talk about C of A's more in just a second. Methods used to fit the purpose of use, and, references need to be appropriate for the type of product that you're using. So basically, again, within FSMA as well as SQF, SQF does not require certificate of analyses. FSMA does not require a certificate of analysis. But the key is when you do use them, define how and why and how often, etc. So let's talk a little bit about certificate of analysis. So we're kind of out of the preventive control slides now. We're back into the Eurofins SQF slides, as it were. So what is a certificate of analysis? And I'll tell you, there's a lot of folks who really put a lot of faith and a lot of trust me, I work for a company that creates a ton of certificate of analysis, and it's important for us to know and educate everyone on what they are and importantly, what they're not. But what they are, certificate of analysis is a result of an assessment against a specification or a standard. A lot of times people, I'll be out in facilities and I'll talk about receiving product, and they'll say, oh, well, we get a certificate of analysis. And I'll be like, well, what are you analyzing? And they're like, well, we don't know. It's a C of A. And I said, well, what are you Aing? What's the analysis? What are you checking for? And they're like, we don't know. Well, you should at least, somebody should at least know what's the analysis that we're concerned with. So what is the specification or target standard that we're assessing against? It is a verification activity. It's not a monitoring activity. It's verification. It's after the fact. And again, it's important to understand that it is a sample representation of a lot or a batch of product. It is not fully comprehensive. It is not fully representative of the entire product or the entire population. It is a sample. It is a small sample. And usually it's a purchase activity between a buyer and a seller to say, we want to have a certificate of analysis in place to make sure that the product meets certain parameters. So what is it not? It is not a control mechanism. Many times when I'm talking with customers and they say, well, I don't need a preventive control because I get a C of A. Well, no. Again, a certificate of analysis is not a control. You're not controlling the hazard by taking a 25-gram sample and testing it. That is not controlling the hazard. That is a verification activity. It's not a control. And secondly, it is not a guarantee of the representation of the entire product. We certainly want homogeneous distribution, and certainly for chemical analysis, we'd like to think that it's more homogeneous distributed. But certainly we know with microbiology, within food products, there is definitely not homogeneous distribution. There are starts and stops. There are clumps and ebbs and flows, as it were, within a lot of product. And remember, lots can be 50,000 pounds, 100,000 pounds, 250,000 pounds. I mean, very, very, very large products, populations, and a sample may be 25 grams, 50 grams, 100 grams, so extremely small portion of that population. So when do you need a certificate of analysis? So a couple of things. First off, you don't always need one. You don't always have to have a certificate of analysis. Certainly when you have a food safety consideration, and again, this is one of those things where we talk about risk. If you're looking at your suppliers and your ingredients and you say, okay, well, maybe my high-risk suppliers, I'm going to ask for a certificate of analysis. For my low-risk suppliers, I don't need one. But again, you base it on risk, and one of the questions to ask yourself when you're doing those risk determinations is, does the supplier control a hazard that I'm not going to be able to control once it comes in? So, for example, I'm getting liquid pasteurized eggs, and they're controlling salmonella, and I'm making salad dressing with it, and I'm not going to cook it. Or I'm getting in, coffee beans, roasted coffee beans, or roasted chocolate, or spices, or anything like that, where the hazard is being controlled by the supplier. I'm receiving peanuts and I'm worried about aflatoxin. The supplier, there's nothing that you're going to be able to do about it if it comes in with that hazard in it. So, it's important that supplier has to exert control, and the certificate of analysis, again, is verification that that control is being exerted. We may have had abuse occurred prior that caused the hazard to be formed. This could be things like histamine in fish, or, again, aflatoxin in peanuts or barley or whatnot, or, Staphylococcus aureus grow out, or Bacillus cereus in rice. Or certainly we could have chemical hazards. We could have heavy metals. We could have pesticides. We could have, other toxins, as it were. Definitely for quality considerations. I'm getting manganese, and I expect 400, milligrams of concentration, or I expect, a Brix level to be 3% or 12% or whatever I expect it to be. That is certainly where a certificate of analysis would be an important verification tool. Product functionality, again, it's key to how our product performs: color, size, pH, etc. Or, we talked about the nutritional factors. Vitamin A, I expect a certain concentration, a certain type of minerals in a certain concentration. Or authenticity, food fraud. I expect it to be the type of fish I expect it to be. I expect it to be extra virgin olive oil. I expect it to be honey. I expect it to be cranberry juice. I expect it to be, whatever it is I expect it to be. I expect it to be a certain spice. And is it? And certainly food fraud and authenticity testing is a big part of requiring certificate of analysis as well. So let's, from certificate of analysis, we get as a reference from the product specification. So real quickly, I just want to go through, what is a product specification? It is a statement describing the identity of the food. It's a statement of any contaminants of concern within the product, and it's going to define key quality, key chemical, key food safety, key physical parameters are all defined. And for the analysis of those parameters, when analysis is required, we must always reference the method, and we must always reference the sampling plan and limits so that we know what it is we're supposed to be assessing and looking for. What are our targets? What is it supposed to be? And especially for those folks who are looking to build out a quality plan, be it level 3 now or to the quality certification under version 8. Product specification is the main source of what your quality plan needs to have. All of those key quality parameters of the product and how it performs, those need to be addressed in your quality plan. So what are some of the common challenges with product specifications? A lot of times the sampling plan is not identified. A lot of times the method's not identified. A lot of times the criteria isn't defined. The specification sometimes. Sorry?
Gary,
okay,
can you hear us? Yep, sorry.
Yeah.
I think we might have been experiencing a technical difficulty, but go ahead, continue.
Okay, sorry. So sometimes the specification does not include any quality or safety characteristics. And, a lot of times I'll see a lot of, salmonella negatives. What does that mean? In what size of product, what kind of sampling plan, what method. A lot of times I'll see a product specification that's got, yeast, mold, coliform, E. coli, Enterobacteriaceae, Listeria, E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, Staph. And I'm like, wow, we don't really need all of these different types of analyses. Every analysis should tell us something. We don't need to have all of those in there. So make sure your product specifications are relevant and practical, and make sure that they help you drive and make good decisions about the results of those analyses. Real quickly, I want to go through some sampling plan just as far as, because I mentioned in the product specifications and the certificate of analysis, we should use sampling and we should define it. So what does that mean? And what are some of the basic terminologies that we talk about? In sampling plan, a lot of times you'll see the number, the little n, which means the number of samples taken from a lot. The little c is the maximum number of unsatisfactory results, so that's generally going to be 0 in 2-class plans or pathogen testing, qualitative testing. Little m and big M, those are only used really in 3-class plans where we're dealing with quantitative analysis or counts. And when we're talking about sampling plan, we basically fall out into two conditions. We have where we're doing a two-class plan, which is basically acceptance or rejection. It's pretty much absence or presence of the product or of the concern, and that is mainly pathogen testing. You know, is it present? Is it not? Is it positive? Is it negative? Those are two-class sampling plans. Three-class sampling plans we use quite a bit when we're doing quantitative analysis, when we're counting something. How many aerobic plate counts are in there? How many coliforms are in there? How many yeast or mold are in there? And we can get a better representation of the results if we use multiple samples and have a three-class sampling plan. So some of the different types of examples of sampling plans we can use include obviously indicators like aerobic plate count. Obviously in the dairy world we deal with standard plate count, coliforms, Enterobacteriaceae, fecal coliforms, generic E. coli, yeast and mold, some of the very common quality food safety indicators that we use. Again, those would all be counts. Those would all be really under a three-class sampling plan for quantitative analysis. Other counts could include Staphylococcus aureus, Bacillus cereus, Lactobacillus, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this two-class sampling plans is where we get into the pathogen testing, like Listeria, Salmonella, pathogenic E. coli, some of the certainly most common types. And again, you'll notice our reference here is the ICMSF Book 7, where we go through, and that's really a definitive reference for all things around establishing statistically valid sampling plans in the food industry. Now, this chart I wanted to bring up, and this is probably the most significant chart as far as product testing that I have ever encountered. This, as you see, it's from the ICMSF, International Commission on Microbiological Specifications in Foods, Book 7. And basically what this tells us, I want you to just take a second and look at this. As we know, most product specifically contaminated with pathogens is certainly not uniformly distributed. We know that the pathogens may be in parts of the product, but not others, at the beginning, at the end, in the middle, wherever. Generally, what we see in outbreaks and recalls is we've got anywhere from a 2 to 10% or a defect rate, or 2 to 10% of the product is contaminated. So it's not uniform, it's not homogeneous. So basically, if you look at this chart, what it tells you is that, let's take a look at, let's say, 5%. So 5% of the lot is defective, which means, let's say, for example, we're looking at, 50,000 pounds of spices, and let's just assume 5% of that 50,000 pounds is defective with salmonella. So 5% of it is contaminated with salmonella. What that means is, if you look across that row there at 5% defect rate, if you go to under 5, which means 5 samples taken from that lot, and you go down to 5% defect rate, that means 77% of the time we are going to accept that lot because those 5 samples are going to be negative. So those 5 samples are going to be negative 77% of the time. And that's 5 samples from that one lot, not just 1, but 5. So 3/4 of the time we're going to accept that product with 5% salmonella in the entire lot because those 5 samples didn't find that 5% of salmonella that was in that population. So, how often do we take 5 samples from a lot? And then I'll ask the question, as you see at the bottom of the slide there. So when we pull a 125-gram sample, which is what a very common sample that most of us pull from products when we're doing certificate of analysis, how valid do we think those results are? If you look at the number 1, obviously it's not even on that chart. How often do you think we're going to find that 1 out of 20, as it were, with a 5% defect rate, that we're going to have that be positive? Obviously, it's extremely unlikely that 125-gram sample is actually going to find the salmonella if it's only positive at a 5% rate. And you might say, okay, well then, wow, that's scary. What do we do with that? Well, if you notice from the chart, and you look at this chart specifically, if we're looking for pathogen testing, which is really the bottom row of this chart, we shouldn't be testing any products with less than 15 samples pulled from each lot. So that's for pathogen testing, for second two-class sampling plans. 15, N equals 15 samples from every lot is the minimum we should be taking to give ourselves any validity at all to be able to find if we do have a pathogen in that product, we're going to find it. It gives our, minimum 15, and you see all the way up to ready-to-eat foods, we're looking at N equals 60. So we're pulling 60 samples, 60 25-gram samples, 1,500 grams total, to be tested. That gives us a 95% confidence that if that product is contaminated with the pathogen of interest, we're going to find it 95% of the time. So that is those are the types of statistics that we need to think about when we're defining our sampling plans. So I want to just close up here as we're getting close to the top of the hour and review a little bit and talk about, okay, I threw a lot of stuff at you. Now, practically, what does it mean? When we look at SQF versus FSMA, and I'm having my audit come, February or March of next year, what does that mean to me? Well, if we look at SQF and compare and contrast, we know that, as far as supplier approval and verification, the SQF program requires that supplier approval program must be documented. We must assign risks based on, the type of product and the supplier. We must have product specifications. We must have a register of approved suppliers. And we must consider food fraud and food defense within those risk assignments. Our vulnerability assessment for food fraud is now required in version 8, and that's a whole other discussion to have on food fraud. But food fraud and food defense are now required in the consideration of supplier approval and verification, as well as, their own separate elements within the standard. So, we have to consider those under our risk assignments as well. Under FSMA, a lot of that is not covered. But what FSMA does have is that we do have to define a preventive control when the supplier is dealing with a hazard on our behalf. We have to define that preventive control must be written into our food safety plan. When the supplier is controlling a hazard on our behalf and is a significant hazard, we have to do an on-site audit. That's above and beyond SQF. We have to do an on-site audit, has to be done annually, has to be location specific, has to be done by a qualified auditor. All those requirements are above and beyond SQF. The verification activity required for foreign suppliers to meet FSMA, above and beyond, it could be above and beyond SQF. SQF requires that all suppliers, whether they're domestic or foreign, have to have some assessment of their food safety plan. But again, audits aren't required. It could be a questionnaire, it could be a survey. Within FSMA, foreign suppliers, an audit has to be done. For preventive control suppliers, an audit has to be done. So basically, for all international suppliers, whether you're dealing with them through your supplier preventive control or through Foreign Supplier Verification Program, on-site audit to verify FSMA compliance is required, and that goes above and beyond the SQF rule. Now, again, under 2.4.1 of the SQF code, which states the suppliers must meet local regulatory requirements, your SQF auditor is going to be auditing you against these FSMA requirements when your compliance dates come into effect. So as a review, again, compliance dates for preventive control for human food started September of 2016 for over 500 employees, September of 2017 for those medium-sized companies, over $2.5 million in sales, and September of 2018 for all those under the PMO, everyone under $2.5 million in sales. Basically, everybody else who's not exempt has to have the preventive controls in place by September of 2018. So once your requirement date comes online, your SQF auditor will be auditing you against the FSMA requirements, those few FSMA requirements around supplier approval and verification, which are above and beyond the SQF requirements. So again, just as a quick review, steps to supplier verification, identify who all of your suppliers are, private label, co-manufacturers, make sure you understand who all the suppliers are, location specific, define those list of ingredients, by risk, high, medium, low, whatever way you want to use that. Again, the ingredients as well as the supplier. What are the program parameters? Document that program. That's your approved supplier program. Your program parameters would be, what are my risk assignments? How do I approve them? What information do I need to approve them? And document that program. So that's your approved supplier program. Communicate this to your purchasing group. Communicate this to your suppliers. Define what your raw material specifications are going to be, working with your purchasing team, working with your suppliers. And then start your certificate of analysis requirements, start your product evaluations, and then start, potentially doing audits of your private label suppliers, your high-risk suppliers. Do those first. So that's kind of, if you're just new to supplier approval and verification, those are kind of a roadmap, an implementation, step-by-step process, as it were, to kind of get you started if you haven't done it already. Obviously, if you're SQF certified, you've already got one in place, so probably you're much more interested in how is FSMA going to be incorporated into that, and what's the auditor going to be looking at when they, when they come into against version 8 now that FSMA is in place. So in summary, data from SQF shows that, again, up to 20% of recalls are from, at certified SQF certified facilities, maybe due to contaminated product coming into their facility from their suppliers. So again, you're inheriting someone else's problem, and it happens up to 20% of the time. A documented supplier approval program and verification program is required for SQF certification, as well as for FSMA compliance, again, when suppliers are controlling a hazard on your behalf or for all international suppliers. Understanding the strategy of risk management behind the key activities of supplier approval and verification is your key to protecting your brand and minimizing your risk of concerns. So with that, I will say thanks very much. I know that hopefully we've got a few questions. Some folks have come in. We've allotted some time here at the end for those. If we don't get to your question and you would certainly like to follow up with me, feel free to contact me. My email there is directly. You can email direct directions to me. I think SQF will also be sending me a list of the questions that we don't get to answer here, so I can follow up with you directly. And then also you can, if you're interested more to talk to us about what other activities we can do, there is our Eurofins website on the page there as well. So with that, Sarah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Hi, Gary. This is Leslie. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, Leslie? I can, Leslie, yeah.
No worries. We did get a number of questions in. So we actually received a few that are related to on-site audits and FSMA requirements. So I'm going to start there because I think that'll knock out several questions in one. But one question is, can the supplier's annual SQF audit or GFSI or a third-party audit count as the on-site audit for FSMA, or is that something that has to be a separate audit covered by the receiving facility?
That's a great question, and we've actually asked that question to FDA specifically. And the result that we've had is that because there are elements of the preventive control rule, like a few of those things I mentioned just here on supplier approval, and other things like, the requirement of a PCQI, a requirement for environmental monitoring. I mean, there was a few gaps between what FSMA requires in SQF or BRC or FFSC or any of the other GFSI standards. Because there are some gaps, the FDA has basically said a GFSI audit in and of itself will not satisfy the on-site audit requirement. But that's why many of the companies or the organizations like SQF and like BRC and like GFSI have created these FSMA addendums to go along with the SQF audit or the BRC audit or the FSSC audit, so that those FSMA extra pieces are covered. Now, you have to remember, SQF is, a standard that's in 35 different countries. So, SQF can't have one standard that fits everybody's regulatory requirements. FSMA is obviously big and it's impacting the whole world, but, Canada has their own new regulations, Australia. I mean, you can't have everybody's regulation in SQF. So there's going to be a few bits and pieces that fall outside of it, and that's why we have those addendums. So really, to answer the question, the FDA would be looking for an SQF audit plus that FSMA extra component, as we call it, the FSMA addendum, which covers those few pieces of FSMA that are above and beyond what SQF is asking.
Okay, thank you. We also had a couple questions related to, I guess, questionnaires. So another one is, under FSMA, do we need to have suppliers audited, or will a questionnaire or survey be sufficient?
Yeah, good question. Again, the key thing is that it is determined during the hazard analysis when you're building your food safety plan, is the supplier, controlling a hazard on your behalf? So if the supplier is controlling a hazard on your behalf, you have to build a supplier preventive control, and as part of verification of the supplier preventive control, you have to have an on-site audit. A questionnaire will not be sufficient. So that's again, one area where SQF and FSMA differ. SQF on questionnaires are acceptable. FSMA, when the supplier is controlling a hazard on your behalf, and it is a significant hazard, an on-site audit by a qualified auditor is required.
Okay.
But
are there?
Let me just follow. Yeah, sorry. Let me just follow up on that. If you don't have that situation where you're having a supplier who is controlling a hazard on your behalf, then you can divert to the SQF criteria, and questionnaires of suppliers are sufficient. So it really is going to be determined by you when you're building your food safety plan and doing your hazard analysis. And the key question is, are there suppliers who are controlling hazards on our behalf, and are those hazards significant? The answer is yes, you have to have an on-site audit. The answer is no, questionnaire for SQF is sufficient.
Okay. Do you have any tips for defining requirements for suppliers with respect to FSMA? What should we be asking of suppliers to prove that they are compliant with FSMA and FSVP beyond a letter of guarantee?
Well, again, if for FSVP, it's got to be an on-site audit. A letter of guarantee doesn't. Letter of guarantees aren't recognized in FSMA at all. So for foreign suppliers, you have to have an on-site audit done by a qualified auditor. For domestic suppliers, again, letter of guarantee under FSMA doesn't mean anything. The key question is that supplier controlling a hazard on your behalf? Are they killing salmonella and you're not going to cook it? Are they dealing with aflatoxin and you're not going to address aflatoxin? Are they dealing with, listeria, pathogenic E. coli, whatever, and you're not going to address it? If they are, you've got to have an on-site audit. Letters of guarantee don't mean anything. So, the key question is, when you're doing your hazard analysis, are suppliers controlling hazards on your behalf? Meaning you're not going, if it comes in with the hazard in it, there's nothing you can do about it. If that's the case, you've got to have an on-site audit. Letters of guarantee don't mean anything.
Okay. In regards to FSMA, do we need to assign a risk associated, like high, medium, or low, to each ingredient received, even though there may not be a serious hazard?
FSMA does not ask for the risk assignments. That's an SQF requirement. So again, it's sometimes hard to, we're trying to keep them straight. The assignment of materials, raw materials, and suppliers to risk, that's an SQF requirement. So that's part of the supplier approval program. You have to have the risk assignment for the SQF compliance. FSMA does not ask for risk assignment. What FSMA asks, again, is the question, when you're doing your hazard analysis, is the supplier dealing with a control on your behalf? Risk is irrelevant. If they are, then they're high risk, and you have to have those on-site audit verification activities. If they're not, you don't. So SQF is the requirement for the risk assessments, and SQF is asking for the high, medium, low. How do you define high, medium, low, or whatever? It doesn't even have to be high, medium, low. Whatever criteria, whatever levels you want to assign it, that's up to you. And then you determine, okay, based on that, here's what I'm going to do for high, medium. Here's what I'm going to do for high risk. Here's what I'm going to do for low risk. Here's what I'm going to do for medium risk.
Okay. When looking at the supplier approval process, what suppliers should be approved? For instance, should the company filling a vending machine be approved or involved in a risk assessment?
Great question. You know, really when we're looking at both from a FSMA standpoint and an SQF standpoint, ingredients are really only those suppliers to which, as well as packaging. So I would say I would include packaging, folks, primary packaging specifically, packaging that's going to touch the product, plus ingredients that go into the product, plus any processing aids that's going to touch the product, would need to be as part of the supplier approval program. So, you know, the uniform supplier, the, you know, the landscaper, you know, the vending machine, you know, that they are not, you know, that, in my interpretation, they would not need to be part of the approved supplier program. They need to be on your contract service log, perhaps as part of SQF, your contract service provider. But if they're in, you know, if they're going in the plant or whatnot. But as far as your approved supplier program, and you know, only that product, only those ingredients that are actually impacting, touching the actual product would need to be in the approved supplier program.
Okay. Is it acceptable for the same company to use different models of risk assessment or different techniques, like simplified models versus more developed models like HACCP?
Sure. You know, that's the beauty of SQF is that it doesn't define how you do it. It tells you have to do it. It tells you kind of what your objective is and what your end game is. But as far as how you get there, it's up to you. So, you know, you can have any means by which you define these risks and assign them and assess them and vet them and use them to come up with different activities and different monitoring activities. That's completely up to you. And again, one company can have, you know, maybe for one process they have a certain process, and for another process they have a different way to do it. It doesn't matter. As long as it's documented, as long as it's understood, as long as it's implemented, that's what matters.
Okay. What types of documentation must we require of our international suppliers in order to be compliant with both SQF and FSMA?
Well, again, that's a great question. For the international suppliers, you know, FSMA kind of kicks in and almost takes precedent over SQF because FSMA has everything above and beyond what SQF requires. So really what you're going to, because SQF requires an assessment of their food safety controls, which, you know, FSMA requires that certainly as well. So for international suppliers, you really have to have an assessment of their compliance to the preventive control rule, be it human food or animal food, doesn't matter. How do they comply with the rule? So it's, you know, what's the state of their food safety plan? Do they have a trained preventive control qualified individual? Are they following the GMPs in 117? Do they have, you know, qualified individuals? Have they done their food safety training? Have they done their hygiene training? You know, do they have the preventive controls documented? You know, do they have the elements of FSMA? Do they have that in place? Has that been assessed by a qualified auditor? You know, you know, a certificate showing the compliance to FSMA, you know, from what the agency has told us, the FDA has told us, that is not enough. They want to see the report. They want to see the verification that these things have been assessed by a qualified auditor, and here's what the findings were. So that's what type of documentation the company in the United States who's using those foreign suppliers and using their ingredients in their products, that's what they need to have. Now, there isn't, again, it can be an SQF audit plus the SQF addendum, can be a unaccredited audit, can be, you know, a simple FSMA checklist. But, you know, there isn't, the agency doesn't define it has to be any kind of, you know, specific type of audit, but it has to cover the verification of compliance to the preventive control rule, either human food or animal food.
All right, here's another one that's also kind of in relation to international suppliers. If I'm a broker importing from different countries, am I subject to FSMA audits as a part of my supplier preventive control? Also, am I responsible for ensuring that FSVP program for my suppliers is in compliance for my customers that import into the U.S.?
Okay, good question. And again, we've had a lot of conversation with brokers and agents. Brokers and agents, unless they take physical possession of the product, they are not under compliance to the rule. They don't, FSMA doesn't apply to them if they, unless they take physical possession of the product. So most of the time they don't. Most of the time they are a broker. They're a middleman. They're connecting the two parties who are interested in doing a business. So under FSMA, they don't have any specific requirements. Now, having said that, certainly we're recommending and we're advising that, for brokers and agents to be most helpful to their customers. We certainly, and I've recommended to many of our customers, say, look, if you're dealing with brokers and agents, you need to be telling them now, don't send me any locations for new products unless you've got their paperwork that shows how they comply with FSMA with it, because I can't use it. So I'm just going to have to go out and get it myself if you don't give it for me. So, brokers and agents, when they're vetting and finding those new locations, internationally, they need to add to their questionnaire of, how do they approve, a location for one of their U.S. customers is, how do you comply with FSMA? Do you have a PCQI? Have you had a third-party audit? And send me a copy of that because I'm going to have to share it with my U.S. customers. So really brokers and agents should be adding that information gathering up front. And if locations don't have that information, either they got to go get it or you got to find a different location.
Okay,
and
we
again,
actually had a couple.
Sorry. Just one last thing. The key there is that it's location specific as well. It's not just company. So we can't just approve, a company internationally. It's got to be location specific, which I know can be somewhat challenging sometimes.
Okay. We actually had a couple more follow-up questions asking for clarification about on-site audits. A couple people asked, who has to audit the suppliers? Is it someone from my own company, or do we have to hire someone from outside, like an outside auditor, to audit my suppliers?
Yeah, has to be someone who's a qualified auditor, and it can't be the supplier themselves. So it can be someone from your company. It can be somebody that the supplier hires, a third-party certification body auditor. It can be somebody from the government. So let's say that you're supplying or you're getting, product from Mexico, and the Mexican government has been in there and done a food safety audit. That could be a qualified auditor as well. So government agents can be qualified auditors. Agents of certification bodies, certification body auditors like Eurofins auditors, they're qualified auditors. It can be somebody from, your company going to visit a supplier. As long as they meet the definition of a qualified auditor, they can do it as well. So the supplier can arrange it, you can arrange it, you can go conduct it, the government can conduct it. Again, the key there is that it has to meet the definition of they're a qualified auditor, and the supplier can't be doing it of themselves. They can't do an internal audit like a questionnaire and send it to you.
Okay. That's good, because another question we got is, what exactly is a qualified auditor? How do you determine that?
Yeah, the rule defines it in two ways. One is they have to be trained in auditing. So if you've had, internal food safety auditor, if you've had a lead auditor training class, if you've had any type of auditor training, you're a qualified auditor. If you've done any second or third party audits, so if you've done supplier audits, if you've done, any type of other than internal audits, if you've done any audits of any external companies, you're a qualified auditor. So basically there's two ways to be a qualified auditor, through training or through experience, and that's specifically defined within the rule.
What is a common interval to re-audit low and medium risk suppliers? Biannually?
I would say, annual is pretty the default, but I do know that with some low risk suppliers, every 2 years is not uncommon. 18 months to 2 years is not uncommon. So I don't think that, if I've got a salt supplier, if I've got a sugar supplier, if I've got, a dry powder or anything like that, there's nothing wrong with saying we're going to audit them, or we're going to require a third party audit from them every 2 years. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Again, the key is just define what your frequency is, define what your schedule, and have a good reasoning as to why. So you can say, well, all of our low risk, and here's what makes them low risk, but all of our low risk folks, we only ask for an audit every 2 years. Perfect. That fits SQF criteria perfectly.
Okay, I think we're going to take just a couple more questions and then call it a day. Again, if we don't get to your question here coming up, then you can contact Gary. His information is on the screen. So one next question. Would allergen control programs at supplier facilities be considered a form of supplier controlling a hazard on our behalf? If we are receiving ingredients and trusting the allergen documentation that they provide is accurate and we're not testing every single ingredient we receive, would we need to audit their facility?
Yes. Allergen management could certainly be a supplier preventive control program. So if you're going through your hazard analysis and for example, that supplier produces a product for you that doesn't have allergens, but they may have allergens in their facility, you may have to say, well, you know what, we're not sure that, we're not comfortable with their control programs in place, so we're going to build a supplier preventive control, and we're going to actually go out and audit them once a year to make sure their allergen management program is where it needs to be. And we may be doing periodic testing to verify that there's no allergens in the product they're sending us. That certainly is within a normal, rational, or you may be saying, we get one type of allergen, but we know they have other allergens in the facility. We want to make sure there's no cross contact there. So we're going to build a supplier preventive control to assess that hazard. That's certainly reasonable, and I think, I'm sure the agency would be expecting to see similar types of activities such as that.
Does a manufacturer that is SQF Level 2 have to be FSMA ready?
They have to be FSMA ready when their compliance dates come. So again, for all those folks who make human food, we're 2/3 of the way through FSMA compliance now. Again, the first one was September 2016. The second one was September 2017. The last one is September of 2018. So, essentially I would certainly highly recommend as folks are moving into version 8 of SQF that if you're not already FSMA ready, you definitely get FSMA ready before your next SQF audit. Because again, if you're under the FSMA rule and your compliance dates have already passed, your SQF auditor will be assessing you against the SQF standard, but also FSMA those extra above and beyond FSMA components as part of the regulatory requirement of SQF, which is under 2.4.1.
For my register of approved suppliers, do my suppliers need to each be labeled with a high or low risk?
You can put it on the register if you want, or you can have it somewhere else. It really, again, it doesn't matter as long as you have somewhere that you have assessed those suppliers and assigned them a risk category. Whether you put it on your register of approved suppliers, that's as good a place to put it as any. If you want to have it documented somewhere else, that's fine too. As long as, when it can be referenced, it can be easily accessed, and people understand what it means and how to use it. And there's, some activities based on, here's what I do for high risk, here's what I do for low risk. So, maybe putting it on the register might be the best place to put it. But it's really up to you. It depends on what fits best within your system.
All right, and I'm going to make this the last question of the webinar, and this is in regards to the foreign supplier verification once again. As a company, do we still need to conduct an audit if our foreign supplier provides a general document stating that they're controlling their hazards?
Yes. So again, that customer or that supplier cannot be providing you, under FSMA, cannot be providing you the assessment of their food safety controls. Within SQF, they can, based on risk, but within FSMA, for the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, they can't. You have to have some external verification of their compliance to the rule above and beyond them saying, yes, we meet the rule.
All right. Gary, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to present. And thank you to everyone else who registered and attended today's event. We also got a lot of questions in regards to the presentation. Obviously, if you had a question and it was not addressed here in the follow-up, once again, Gary's information is on the screen if you'd like to reach out and get some clarification on anything that he talked about here today. And also, as we mentioned before we started the presentation, we are recording this event, and it will take us a couple days to process this and then upload it to YouTube. But if you want to check back by, I want to say, Tuesday next week, which I believe is October 31st, we should have this up on our YouTube channel, and I will follow up with an email at that time to everyone that registered and attended, so you guys will have access to his presentation and can go back and revisit his notes. But thank you so much for attending. Thank you once again to Gary, and please keep an eye out for our next Learning Lunch webinar.